Plymouth was created in 1928 as a low-priced spin-off of the Chrysler brand, initially only sold through Chrysler dealerships, and called the Chrysler Plymouth, a name that was chosen as being recognizably American, adopting the ship the Mayflower as the car's logo. Priced under $700, it was built on a 109-inch wheelbase with standard hydraulic brakes and powered by an 170 cubic inch inline bore. Sometimes referred to as either the Chrysler or Plymouth Model Q, it became an instant success. For its second year, it was simply the Plymouth Model U, and the engine was up to 175 cubic inches and 45 horsepower. And in spite of a downturn in the economy, or perhaps because of it, sales were already over 100,000. Then for 1930, it was up to 196 cubic inches and 48 horsepower, and sales dropped to just over 75,000. But the line would soon be revised as the P Series, with the PA retaining the 109-inch wheelbase, and the Deluxe PB being offered on a 112 or 121-inch wheelbase. Prices now started under $600, and power was up to 56 to 65 horsepower. It was the same engine, but now on floating rubber motor mounts, for the smoothness of an 8. It would also start to be sold through Dodge and DeSoto dealerships, and Plymouth would soon be in third in overall sales, where it stayed for the next 30 years. Wheelbases would be down for 1933 to 107, 108, and 112, but the cars were upgraded to 190 cubic inch straight 6, with 70 horsepower. Still considered the P Series, they would typically be referred to by their trim level, Standard, Deluxe, and Special. It would also start to be exported to many outside markets, but often as a Chrysler. For 1934, the cars moved to independent front suspension. The engine was increased to a 201 cubic inches with 77 horsepower, and wheelbases were 108 or 114, only to change again for 1935 to 113 and 128, and would continue to fluctuate up and down almost every year. It would be more streamlined that year, and for 1936, base models would become the Business Series, and they would start to offer a light truck in 1937 as a pickup, wagon, or panel van. 1938 models got a much more rounded front. Then a restyle for 1939 added unusual squared-off headlights, only lasting through the year. But the new Road King base model would last a bit longer. And in 1940, they finally settled on a 117-inch wheelbase for most models, and would stick with it. But 1941 would be the final year of the light pickups and wagons. The styling would be updated again for 1942, and the engine would increase to 218 cubic inches for 95 horsepower, just in time for production to be stopped for the war effort, to return mostly unchanged in 1946, except the price, up to nearly $1,100 for the year, and would continue to climb quickly in the post-war recession. The mid-year restyle for 1949 saw integrated fenders on the late series cars, but otherwise the update was very conservative. Offered on a 111 or 119-inch wheelbase, it used a function-over-form approach, with the focus being passenger space, in contrast to the lower and sleeker cars appearing in the rest of the market. The trim lines were restructured for 1951 as the Concorde, Cambridge, and Cranebrook, which would be manufactured in Australia as Plymouth, Dodge, and DeSoto, and a few years later, just as a Chrysler. The refresh of 1953 cleaned up the lines, removing the rear fender bulges, and a high-drive semi-automatic was added, with the fully automatic Power Flight arriving the next year, as well as an optional 230 cubic inch 6 with 110 horsepower, 10 more than the smaller 6, and models were renamed Plaza, Savoy, and Belvedere, but the dated styling seemed stodgy. The restyle of 1955 was intended to correct that, and the addition of a new V8 also helped, essentially a Dodge 4-liter 241 Hemi, but with polyspherical heads, also referred to as a poly or semi-Hemi, with up to 167 horsepower. Mid-year, it would be enlarged to a 4.2-liter 259, marketed as a 260, raising horsepower by 10 to 177, and the 230 flathead 6 was up to 117 horsepower. The 260 increased in size again for 1956 to a 270, with 180 horsepower. But Plymouth also introduced the new A-block engine, which also used poly heads. It was offered as a 4.5-liter 276, marketed as a 277, providing 187 horsepower, or up to 200 horsepower with the Power Pack 4-barrel, or in the new Sporty Fury as a 5-liter 303, which had 240 horsepower, and special gold and white trim. Instead of continuing to play catch-up with GM styling, Chrysler attempted to leap ahead of the competition for 1957, with longer, lower, and wider styling with large fins, with Plymouth advertising saying, "Suddenly it's 1960." The 270 was dropped, and the optional V8 became a 4.9-liter 301, except in the Fury, which now used a 5.2-liter 318 poly with 290 horsepower. 1958 would see the introduction of the big B-block wedge head engine, initially as a 5.7-liter 350, and then as the 5.9-liter 361 for 1959, followed by a 6.3-liter 383 for 1960, when a new overhead valve slant 6 replaced the ancient flathead 6, a 3.7-liter 225 in the standard models, and a 2.8-liter 170 in the new unitized compact A-body Valiant, which was initially marketed as its own brand, but soon it would be badged as a Plymouth and get the bigger slant 6. The standard models would follow the Valiant's example, moving to the unitized B-body for 1962. The cars were somewhat smaller than before, on a 2-inch shorter wheelbase, with controversial styling. Two factors often blamed for Plymouth's drop from the third-place position, although it remained in the top 5. And by this point, the cars could be ordered with Chrysler's 6.8-liter 413 wedge, with a cross-ram manifold, as the Plymouth Superstock. With 420 horsepower, it could do the quarter mile in under 14 seconds and reach speeds around 120 miles an hour. The Valiant would get more conservative styling for 1963, and in 1964 gained the new LA small block V8, based on the A engine, but with a more traditional wedge head design, making it cheaper and lighter, although slightly less torquey. Initially as a 4.5-liter 273 with 180 horsepower, also available in a sporty new fastback called the Barracuda. That would become Plymouth's entry into the pony car market, being introduced a few months before the Mustang. For 1965, the base Savoy was dropped. The Fury moved to the new and bigger C-body as the full-size car, bringing wheelbase up to 119 inches, while the Belvedere continued on using the B-body platform as the new mid-sized offering, with top versions called the Satellite, and styling being revised the following year to better fit the segment. Then 1967 would introduce the gentleman's muscle car, the GTX package, nicely equipped and powered by a 7.2-liter 440 Super Commando or 7-liter 426 Hemi with 375 to 425 horsepower, a mid-13-second car capable of 135 miles an hour. The small cars were restyled the same year, with the Valiant and Barracuda becoming much more distinct, not only in styling but in powertrains, with the Barracuda getting a wider range of bigger V8s, starting with the 383 and later moving to the 440. But it was the last year of the standard A-block poly engine, with all small blocks becoming part of the LA or Light A family, including a new 5.2-liter 318 and 5.6-liter 340, with up to 275 gross horsepower. The mid-size cars would be updated again in 1968, getting longer, and the GTX would be joined by a new budget muscle car called the Roadrunner. The full-size Fury moved to the bigger fuselage design for 1969, which started rather conservatively, but would soon gain a wraparound bumper, hardly one of the biggest changes for 1970. In order to gain a NASCAR advantage, the Roadrunner gained a nose cone and giant wing to become the Superbird, a homologation special that was sold to the public in limited numbers, and only for that year. There was a new, wider Barracuda that no longer shared its platform with the Valiant, but included more performance options, from the road racing AAR Cuda with its 290 horsepower 346 pack to the monster Hemi Cuda with the 426. But the old Barracuda carried on with new styling as the Valiant Duster. For 1971, the mid-size cars would move to the fuselage styling, with the coupes getting full wraparound bumpers. More than 2 years before the start of the fuel crisis, Plymouth began importing the Hillman Avenger as the Cricket, and in spite of that car doing poorly, 1973 would be a record year for Plymouth. But things would change quickly. The Fury would get a rushed refresh for 1974 to meet new safety regulations, and the Barracuda was simply killed off. The Cricket became a variation of the Mitsubishi Galant and withdrew to the Canadian market. And Plymouth once again entered the light truck market with the Trail Duster SUV and Voyager van. The restyled midsize cars for 1975 would take over the Fury name, and the big cars became the Grand Fury. The small cars would be redesigned for 1976 with transverse-mounted torsion bars and large rubber bushings, taking on the Volare name, which also became the new Roadrunner, effectively replacing the sportier Duster. Filling in as the other sporty coupe was the Plymouth Arrow, an Americanized version of the Mitsubishi Celeste. But with Chrysler's restructuring, the Grand Fury was dropped after 1977, and the midsize Fury in 1978, with no immediate replacements, except in Canada, where they got a version of the Dodge Diplomat as the Caravelle. They did, however, get another Mitsubishi-based coupe, the Sapporo, named for the Japanese city that hosted the 1972 Olympics, and a new subcompact hatchback inspired by the Volkswagen Golf and developed by Chrysler of Europe as the Horizon, followed by a sporty coupe version as the TC3, later called the Turismo. Then the Cricket would be replaced by the Champ, a Mitsubishi Mirage, and twin to the Dodge Colt. Plymouth returned to the full-size market in 1980 with a new Grand Fury, but by this point, Dodge had moved down market into Plymouth's price point, leaving the Plymouth mostly to the commercial market. The front-wheel drive K car was the new small car for Plymouth starting in 1981, signifying the new direction for the company. But Plymouth still didn't have a full-size lineup, and nothing that they did have was much different from Dodge, and the Trail Duster would be discontinued. The Grand Fury was downsized for 1982, essentially becoming the same car as the Caravelle, but the Caravelle itself would become a K-car-based model the following year. For 1984, the Voyager became the K-car-based minivan and would take the market by storm, leading the trend. Plymouth re-entered the popular mid-size market in 1985 simply by bringing the Caravelle to the U.S. A long-wheelbase version of the Voyager was added for 1987 as the Grand Voyager, and the Reliant was effectively replaced by the much-improved Sundance. But the cheaper and still popular Reliant would continue on for 2 more years, which would also be the last year of the Grand Fury, again with no replacement. The Caravelle was replaced by the even more generic Acclaim, but Plymouth would also introduce the sporty Laser, a Mitsubishi Eclipse, the first Plymouth in over a decade that was distinct from what Dodge offered. But Eagle would get a version the next year, and was more heavily promoted. The Neon was introduced in 1994, and although it proved to be popular, it was also sold as both a Plymouth and a Dodge, only distinguishable by the brand badging, with Plymouth soon getting a new sailboat logo of its own, after using only Chrysler's 5-point Mopar star since the late 1960s. Plymouth would also be the last division to get the new mid-sized cloud car in 1996, as the Breeze, as Plymouth continued to struggle to find an identity, something the Prowler of 1997 was supposed to help with. A modern roadster styled to look like a late 30s hot rod, powered by a 3.5-liter V6 with 214 to 253 horsepower. It sold less than 12,000 over its 5 years. At the beginning of 1999, they announced the new Neon as the first car of the new millennium, but 2000 would be the last year of Plymouth, as the Prowler and Voyager would be moved to Chrysler badging, as did any future planned models, taking Plymouth back to where it originated. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.